I promised myself I wouldn't make this kind of video anymore, but honestly, some things are just too big to ignore. Now, I realise that I'm going to get a lot of comments from people who think that I'm a woke leftist. But German history is one of the things that I talk about on this channel, and when parallels are already being drawn between major events today and what was happening in Germany about 95 years ago, it would be remiss of me not to say anything. So as US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, continues to terrorize the general population, many of its critics have been comparing it to the infamous Gestapo, suggesting that it's part of a new fascist regime being set up even as we speak. I don't think that this is the best comparison, though. That's not to say that the events unfolding over there are not horrifying, they absolutely are, but I personally would compare ICE not with the Gestapo, but with the SA. The Gestapo is a rather different organisation. So perhaps we should start by asking ourselves the question, what was the Gestapo exactly? Now, if, like me, you're British and grew up in the 1980s watching the sitcom Allo Allo, you might remember Herr Flick of the Gestapo. Or if you're not that old, you might be thinking of Stephen Merchant's character in the movie Jojo Rabbit. But of course, these satirical portrayals really don't do justice to the sheer horror of what the Gestapo actually got up to. The word Gestapo is actually a contraction of the phrase Geheime Staatspolizei, which means secret state police. It wasn't secret in the sense that nobody knew it existed, it was secret in the sense that it was responsible for covert surveillance and intelligence gathering. At least that was the intention when it was set up in 1933, although set up is not exactly the right word here. It was formed out of the Prussian Secret Political Police, which had been around since the 1850s. Its job was to monitor political activities and investigate political crimes. It had become necessary, in the eyes of the government, after a revolution in 1848 almost succeeded in putting an end to the absolute monarchy and turning Germany into a parliamentary democracy. The political police was supposed to ensure that that didn't happen again. It failed though, and the German monarchy finally came to an end in 1918, after which the political police had a new task. Now it was to protect democracy against extremists from both the left and the right, which, by the way, included the new National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Again, it failed, and in 1933 it was reformed into the new Secret State Police to guard, once again, against the evils of democracy. Except now, instead of defending the monarchy, it was defending the Nazis. This new organisation quickly became little more than a branch of the government, and its job was to identify and neutralise any remaining political threats to the regime. Unfortunately, it was a little bit too honest, and the government didn't like Gestapo reports that suggested the general population wasn't completely happy with the regime. So in 1936, the surveillance part of its job was taken over by the Security Service, which passed on to the Gestapo any intelligence it gathered about political dissent. The Gestapo was then responsible for not only investigating these reports, but also for administering punishments, which could range from small fines all the way to summary execution, which it was empowered to do without the tedious rigmarole of having to get the courts involved. Not that that would have made much difference, because by then the government had already made sure that all of the judges were Nazis. The Gestapo were brutal and used all kinds of unethical practices to persecute anyone they regarded as an enemy of the state. For example, they would blackmail and torture their victims and even fabricate evidence simply in order to extract confessions from them. But what they didn't generally do was to march around the streets in broad daylight, beating, arresting, and even killing anyone for any reason. That, as I said, was the speciality of the SA. The history of the SA is even more complicated and confusing than that of the Gestapo, but basically it goes back to the very beginnings of what would eventually become the Nazi Party. This was in the uncertain and sometimes violent period between the two world wars, when it was quite normal in Germany for political parties to employ their own security personnel. The Nazis were no exception, and their security guys formed what came to be the Storm Division, the SA. These were not people who were selected for their intelligence. It was a paramilitary organization that specialized in brute force. As the Nazis grew in power and influence, the SA was doing a pretty good job of instigating fights and riots in the streets. Its main targets were communists, social democrats, Jews, and even some Christian groups. In short, they were thugs who, over time, became more and more organized and eventually developed a military-style hierarchy. In 1933, as the Nazi Party was tightening its grip on power, the SA was in effect used as a kind of auxiliary police. Regular police officers were made to patrol together with SA men who were authorized to act on behalf of the state. Once the infamous Reichstag decree was enacted, the SA was suddenly free to do almost anything it wanted, and set about terrorizing, arresting, imprisoning, and torturing anyone they didn't like. However, while the SA helped to put the Nazis in power, it was now in a position to remove the Nazis from power and had therefore become a threat. So in 1934, the party neutralized the SA by assassinating its senior members and taking over its leadership. So, to sum up, the Gestapo was mostly concerned with investigating and punishing political dissent, while the SA was more concerned with terror through brute force. How does this correspond to present-day America? There are, of course, no perfect matches because history doesn't really repeat itself. As the saying goes, it rhymes. So we're not looking for exact parallels, but rough approximations. My impression of ICE's activities at the moment is that they're closer to what the SA might have done. According to reports, its recent massive intake of new recruits has happened with very little oversight and barely any training at all, as evident in the astoundingly unprofessional conduct we've seen of late. So I think that ICE is being or has been reformed into the Trump administration's SA. Bullies who are authorized by the state to bully people. The role of Gestapo, I think, is more likely going to be played by something like the FBI, perhaps with the help of an intelligence agency like the CIA, just as the Gestapo was helped by the security service. And I have to be honest, given the apparent lack of oversight, I have a nasty suspicion that a lot of these new ICE agents were involved in the January 6th insurrection and have little or no formal training. In short, they are, not to put too fine a point on it, thugs. And I think this is what we have to bear in mind. It's not just one organization that we have to worry about. The Nazi regime was supported by a whole network of different organizations, each one protecting all of the others. Okay, after that, I think we could all do with something a lot lighter, so please feel free to check out the video that I've linked to just down there.